Call this meeting of the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee to order, and I'm John McGlennon. I chair the committee and a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors representing the Virginia Association of Counties.
Mr. Vice Chair, City of Falls Church for the day job, representing on TSDAC BML.
Virginia Transit Association.
I'm Kate Mattice with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Jennifer Mitchell, Director of DRPT.
Agenda Board Chief of Transit at DRPT.
And I understand we have Tom Fox is joining us on the line today. The weather not being very good in Blacksburg.
And I'm not sure about Brad. I know Marty unfortunately sent his regrets, so he wasn't able to do that this morning.
Okay. So we're going to start our agenda. We've got a meeting that's planned to run for about 3 hours, including a working lunch, and we're going to begin with the fiscal year 21 application cycle outreach updates. Jen, Jill.
All right. So I'm going to start, before I jump into that, we have a lot of information for you today. Hold on, because we're going to have...
Not like we didn't have anything else to read.
Yeah, so I know everybody is in the holiday spirit, but we're going to load you up with a bunch of what we think is really good information today. We're going to start off... Chris, can you bring up... Oh, there we go. Thank you. We're going to start off and reflect back a little bit. I think we closed out our July meeting and talked about outreach and kind of the upcoming application cycle. So wanted to give you an update on what we had done.
There we go.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about outreach, because I'm really proud of the efforts of our folks to really get out and work with the transit agencies to talk about the programs and the process for applications so that we can make that go even smoother. Now it's going.
I think let's go back one.
Yeah, can you go back? We can go. Yeah, I need to follow the fail kid in my notes. Here we go. All right, so we hosted 7 workshops over basically the last week of October in through the month of November with over 200 attendees. That's probably more than we've had in the past. Last year we changed our focus with all the changes in the program. We had more workshops, and it seems like everybody likes having more workshops and more targeted discussions, so we've kept doing that. We did a webinar on electric vehicles in October. That was in partnership with Virginia Clean Cities and DEQ, talking about the VW mitigation trust funding that we have available and some of the benefits of battery electric buses. We were really grateful that Josh Baker from Alexandria Dash talked about what Alexandria is doing with battery electric buses, so that went really well. We had 2 in-person workshops for our 5310, that's our human service programs. We had one here and one out in Stanton. We had 2 in-person workshops for urban and rural transit, one here and one in Northern Virginia that were also very well attended. We tried something new with our transportation demand management workshop this year because, you know, they're all about getting people out of their cars and reducing travel. They decided instead of having 2 workshops that they were going to do 2 workshops and a webinar all at the same time. So you had the option of attending at our office in Alexandria, our office here, or online. And so it worked, except that the internet went down in Alexandria that day. And we actually had almost everybody on the webinar, and that seemed well received. So we're going to try to incorporate that, that on-demand or that webinar option for more of our workshops next year. Our MPO planning webinar was scheduled. It should have happened a couple weeks ago, and we had a fire alarm right as that webinar started, which has happened to us several times. So we had to reschedule that, and that's going to be next week. During all of these outreach efforts, we've focused on rolling out revised program application guidance and technical guidance. We've put more resources out on our webpage than we had last year. Dan put together a really great quick start guide to kind of walk people through the application process. trying to make it a little easier than it was last year with the review process. We also were able to go in and update our applications. Last year we had a lot of things that were done offline and PDF just because we couldn't get the technology there. I would say we're probably 2/3 of the way there with our fiscal year 21 cycle, so we'll have some more IT changes to incorporate everything into the application coming up in the next year or so, but it's a much better interface, and we were actually able to walk people through that interface in the workshops. Chris, that's still not working, but can you go to the next slide? So our applications, thank you, Travis, to the rescue. Our application cycle opened December 1st. It closes on February 3rd. February 1st ends on the weekend, so everybody gets a bonus of a weekend applications. We do have our program managers that are available to provide technical assistance with those capital applications. We are encouraging people to get with us early. We did have some folks that waited very close to the deadline last year, and I can tell you in terms of how things scored and data that's available, those applications that were done early were better and scored better than the ones that were done at the last minute. So we're going to be going out and doing around quarterly meetings and talking to all of the applicants over the next couple of months, but we're asking folks to let us know what we can do to help them. A couple of reminders, we have to also update their transit development plans or transit strategic plans if there's any changes in their capital program. Those are due in mid-January. And we are, like we did last year, we locked down the inventory the same day that the application cycle closes. So what's in there is how we're going to score things. Last year we did some stuff offline after the application deadline closed, and it just made it a little bit too complicated. So we're going to say what we have on February 3rd is what we're moving forward with. So that's the update on applications and outreach.
Anybody have any questions about this aspect of the agenda? And let me mention that Brad Sheffield has joined us now, too.
How's the weather in Charlottesville, Brad? Icy?
I don't know. I actually stayed the night here. It's just the walk took a little longer than
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say that.
And while we're switching over there too, I do want to point out a couple things that are in your packet. That a new ridership report, which Jen will talk about as well, but also this is a report that we submitted to the General Assembly, which is a requirement that we have, an annual report regarding transit demand management and how it's impacting the use of single occupant vehicles. So just want to let you guys know what that is.
Thank you.
So now we have a report on ridership trends.
Ridership. So I'm going to give you a high-level overview, and then we'll walk through the report that you have. So in terms of ridership, I'm going to start and go to the next slide, please. If you look at national ridership trends, and it's hard to get nice graphical representations of that aren't more than a couple of years old, because most of that relies on data that's got a lag in reporting. But if you look at transit ridership trends, transit ridership has been declining nationally for 6 straight years. I saw APSA release the second quarter of 2019 transit data yesterday that shows a ever so slight uptick. I think it was 0.2% nationwide. So hopefully we'll start seeing that turn. But we'll talk about Virginia's trends in a minute, but I think it's important to note that nationally the trend has been a decline for 6 straight years, and particularly that has been felt in bus ridership. So if we go on to the next slide, we're going to tell you the good news story. Okay. And this chart comes directly from the General Assembly report that Jennifer mentioned to you a minute ago. And we pull out WMATA because we want to, we talk about our performance formula that's based on everything except WMATA, so we want to show you trends that are not including WMATA. So if you look, our overall total for fiscal year 19 showed a slight uptick, 0.2% statewide over fiscal year 18. I think one of the most notable trends that we picked up working on the data was that the trend for bus was up 0.7%. And so that was something that really does go contrary to what the national trends are showing us. And if you look at, this thing's not working again. You go to the next slide. If you look at ridership trends, and again, this comes directly from our report to the General Assembly, about half of the agencies in Virginia are showing increased ridership between 18 and 19, which is fantastic. So we focus a lot, and we have focused a lot on stories like GRTC here in Richmond, Tom and Blacksburg Transit, who were recognized with an APTA award earlier this year. But if you look, it was very reassuring to us to see that about half of the agencies are showing an increased trend in ridership, and that is, that is making a big difference here in Virginia. A lot of those are smaller agencies, but everything that's headed in that positive direction is certainly very encouraging. One of the things that, as we've put more emphasis on performance, we want to go back, and I think it came up in the July meeting as well. You used to get this report that got kind of automatically sent out every month or so. It was data that nobody was validating or checking before it went out, so it may not have been as meaningful. Now that we decided to go ahead and do the validation of the fiscal year 19 data early so that we had that for the General Assembly report, and really thought it was time to start putting out some trend data. So we pulled the ridership piece out of that General Assembly report, and Taylor Zinkins, who's our intern, actually worked on this she spent a lot of time working with Grant on this report. She's watching back in her cubicle, so I'm sure I gave her that shout out. She did a fantastic job pulling this together. We had 4 years of data that we had gone through and revalidated last year. We added a 5th year, so we've got a good 5-year trend. So in this package, you can look at it when you have an opportunity. There's some highlights for a couple of systems, so we go through and have a 5-year trend for each system that's in there as well. So as we start to pull the performance data together to do the operating calculations for this next fiscal year 2021 operating allocation, we're going to be updating that 3-year rolling average of data with a year that half of the systems see an increase. So it's really we're going to see a shift, and how that plays out and how it applies to the formula. We'll get to that in the spring once we get the reporting from the agencies and the revenue miles and hours as part of their data that they've submitted, validated, and into the model. So that's pretty exciting. At least I think it's exciting as we look at the impact that transit's having in Virginia. We, as I mentioned this already, we've reviewed and validated that ridership data. We're working on the revenue vehicle hours and miles and passenger miles traveled right now. One of the things, again, we talked about IT with the application, and we've got more emphasis on data, performance, prioritization. We need to have better tools for how we interact with the transit agencies to get that data. And right now, if you're a transit agency and you're putting that ridership data into Olga, our online system, every month, all it is a box. You type in a number, and that's it. So that number doesn't tell you anything about how that compares to what you did in the year prior. It doesn't tell us anything about what you did in the year prior. So we sat down, we worked with Steve Pittard and his staff and said, what would be helpful to us, and what do we think would be helpful to the transit agency? So we're in the process of making some modifications to Olga to make it more helpful. So what it's going to do is now, instead of just seeing that box where it says put in your data for December of 2019, right beside that box, it's going to show you your data from December of the year prior. And if there's more than a 10% variation plus or minus in that data, it's going to flag it for you and for us to say, whoa, did you key it right? Because a lot of it is keying. Somebody's typing in the wrong numbers. So we want there to be something that visually is going to flag that transit agency when they put their data in. It's going to flag it for us. And we're going to provide an opportunity there for comment, so that if there is a change, and maybe it's, we went through a federal government shutdown earlier this year that impacted some of the Northern Virginia agencies, that would be the kind of place where you'd say, this is what happened to affect us during that time. There's also going to be the ability to clip or to add your supporting documentation. Right now, there's a lot of back and forth between our folks and the transit agencies to review that documentation to validate the numbers. We want to do as much of that through the system as we can. And our goal is to get to where we produce this report more like quarterly, maybe not as hefty or in as much detail. But by putting some tools into the system to help with how the data is reported and validating it on a quarterly basis so it becomes part of our quarterly meetings with the transit agencies, I think it's going to get us into a much better position, and then it's less of a surprise. And quite frankly, it's less of a lift later in the year to try to get that data validated and done. And we think that's going to be really helpful going forward. So I hit on this already, but I think we really are honing in on how do we make sure that we have good data quality and that we maintain program integrity by having good checks and balances on that data to make sure. So any questions on ridership?
Jen, do you have a sense of who's a full reporter to?
So, I mean, we can see all of that through NTD, but this is the data that's reported to the state.
Oh, yeah. It was more of just sense of who is entering similar data and who's not.
Yeah.
That's all. Just wondering.
We have the full report. We have the list. And so, you know, an example, we talked about this back in July, was PMT. And the only place that PMT factors into any of the performance metrics is in the commuter rail sizing metric. And when we go back, it's a handful of agencies in the state that are reporting PMT, but they represent 85% of PMT. So last year we used data that came out of NTD. It was 2 years old. This year we've gone out to that handful of agencies and said, you need to report PMT to us at the same time you report it to NTD. So
I got Neil's email. So I have to get it to you today.
I wasn't going to call you out as one of the on the edge of being late, but yeah. So we keep an eye on that as well. And then when our auditors go back and make their visits and look at data, they're comparing the data that's reported and the data that's NTD. Wow.
Doing a quick skim of the full report, so even though the presentation's not showing WMATA, it looks like you haven't.
We did. They are, yeah. You cannot talk about transit in Virginia without talking about WMATA. We have spent so much time focused on performance for operating assistants. We focus this on the non-WMATA piece.
And the chart in this presentation only addressed those systems that were showing an increase in.
Correct. So we could just as easily done a chart that was the inverse, you know, kind of the one that flips the other way around. That's the other half of the agency, the other end of the spectrum.
I see one typo that I'll tell you about.
Okay. Great. Any other questions?
There's really interesting information here, and I think we go back and talk to Mike.
It's nice to see it pulled out in the chart and just the visual.
Mm-hmm. As we move forward and we get, we don't have transit strategic plans on the agenda today, but as we get more of the strategic planning done and we see more of the systems really taking a look at their routes and their ridership and making some adjustments, I think that's where the story of GRTC here in Richmond and the work that Tom's done in Blacksburg is so valuable, because they've been making those adjustments and you see their trend change as a result. And so I think as we bring more of those strategic plans online and as they're implemented, I think we're going to see the trends change, you know, in more of a broader spectrum.
Yes. Great.
All right, I am not Steve. Want to make sure nobody's definitely confused. But I am going to, on his behalf, Steve couldn't be here today. But one of the things that y'all asked for back in July was for us to give you an update on estimated revenues, because, you know, performance data is part of it, but how big the bucket is another piece of the equation. So the next couple of slides compare the changes in the current revenue estimates that we've received with what was in the 6-year improvement program that came out in June. So overall, for fiscal year 21, we're looking at a 4.4% increase compared to the projection that was in the June 6-year improvement program. I think if you've heard the secretary recently, we did a rather interesting thing in Virginia last year, or no, that's true. VMT is going up, but sales tax on fuel receipts are going down, and that's, energy efficiency of vehicles. So that's a trend we're all looking to change going forward. So you see that negative number in there as a result of the sales tax, but overall we are anticipating a 4.4% increase for fiscal year 21. So makes the pie just a little bit bigger.
Mr. Chair, if I could, that's also the sales tax receipts is also affecting the regional gas tax revenues we see in Northern Virginia. I could expect that's also the case for our HR tax folks. In Northern Virginia, that's primarily affecting WMATA, both in the dedicated funding as well as the funding the region has for WMATA and other purposes. So we're watching this trend very closely as well. It is concerning because we were expecting a certain level of revenue from regional gas tax, and we are not realizing that.
So going forward in terms of the estimate, when you look out to the remaining 5 years, those revenues look relatively flat beyond fiscal 21. We see some negative numbers other than just the sales tax on the fuel. So obviously it's something for us to kind of keep an eye on going forward, but at least for fiscal 21, now we can. Don't know that I can answer any questions on the projections, but happy to take any of them, and we can certainly get the answers like that.
And these are projections we get from our Department of Taxation.
If I could, thank you very much, especially for the out-year projections. This is very helpful information.
And is there anything in the governor's budget message that might have
Stay tuned.
Okay.
The budget will be coming out on the 17th.
Great.
Is there any nuggets of info that we should have and transit agency should have to just when they're engaging any elected officials, especially at the state level?
And actually, we'll go through some more information here about our capital needs, which really was very eye-opening for me. The Secretary has been leading a study on the overall sustainability of the funds, particularly fuel tax, which is a major source of funds for the Transportation Trust Fund. And with all sources of revenues have different sort of profiles for how they grow, depending on whether it's a broad-based tax or a user-based tax. And there's a lot of different funding sources that go into transportation right now. We actually have some charts that show all the different pots of money and where they go. One of the things that I think has been pointed out is that transit and rail are both sort of have been handed revenue sources that aren't necessarily the most stable revenue sources. Although fuel tax is an issue for the entire Transportation Trust Fund. Fuel efficiency is really a major issue it's a great issue. We all want, I hate to say the bad thing, we all want more fuel efficient vehicles. It's a good thing, but it's not good if that's the basis of your, Transportation Trust Fund. And so they have been identifying some potential strategies to try to create a more sustainable Transportation Trust Fund. And they're in the meeting they had earlier this week. I think Lisa, you were there, and Noelle as well. There was some discussion about the potential for indexing the fuel tax and potentially for increasing it as well. So that I think has gotten, unfortunately, some negative coverage over the last week or so. But there will be some, I'm not sure how much it will be in the budget, but there will be some budget language. But I expect that there'll be some legislative proposals as well to help deal with this issue.
Okay.
Great.
So with that, I think we're going to transition to the media part of today's agenda. And ridership is good stuff, but these have a couple of presentations coming up that are really, I'm very proud of them. Some extraordinary work that's been done by our team here over the past few months. First, we're going to go through capital needs assessment, and I want to introduce some folks that you probably haven't seen before. Grant Parks is our manager of transit planning and corridor development. He's been with us since April, so I think he's got one TSDAC meeting sitting in the back of his belt. We're going to throw him right up front today. And then Dan Sonnick works for us. You've seen him before sitting over at the computer, and Dan worked tirelessly on the development of the merit capital prioritization. He may be known internally as the Wizard of Merit, but he's also the Wizard of Capital Needs Assessment at EIT as well. So the next couple of presentations, the work that they've been doing over the past few months with on the capital needs assessment with transit agencies around the state. I know we spent a lot of time a few years ago talking about needs versus revenues, and then things were a little different than what we anticipated.
I know I get asked a lot still about, is there a capital funding cliff? And it's been very hard for us to answer that question because, to be honest, we haven't been receiving the applications that have matched the needs forecasts that the agencies have been providing to us. And so we have been building up an unobligated balance of capital funds. And it's been very difficult to have the discussion about a need for capital funds when any member of the General Assembly or staff can look at our 6-year plan and see that we have a big unobligated balance of capital money. So our team did go back, and these guys have done some great work working with the transit agencies to really scrub the needs assessments and to come up with a much more realistic assessment of the needs and to match that up to our revenues. And they'll paint the picture for you, but I will tell you that it was definitely eye-opening for me to go through this too. I don't want to steal their thunder.
Is Dan Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Wizard?
So I'm going to walk you through the process that we went through to scrub our needs, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to kind of walk you through the results. He has a bunch of graphics, and they're very powerful, and there's a lot of information on there. So if you have any questions or need us to kind of hold, so you can kind of think these graphics through and see what they mean, just please let us know. So I think all of you know that every year we ask our transit agencies to do a 5-year capital budget and submit it through OLGA. Which is then folded into the state's 6-year improvement program. If you've never actually seen it yourself, we ask for information at the project level. So in OLGA, each agency has to input the total cost of the project and the revenue sources, federal, state, and local, and do that for each project that they anticipate implementing over the next 5 years. The intent of this 5-year capital budget is to advise DRPT on how much state funding is going to be requested and needed over the next 5 years. So in preparation for this next legislative session, we wanted to go a little bit deeper into these capital budgets to scrub them and hopefully improve the accuracy, so we felt better and more confident with these figures that we could stand behind them. So the first thing that we did was we downloaded all the data. We went line by line, so project by project at the staff level, just to see if anything stood out to us. So I think there were somewhere between 300 and 400 projects that we looked at. We would flag them, flag any projects that seemed out of place, if the years were off, if they were programmed in kind of a different year than what we were expecting, and then also if the cost estimates were higher or lower than what we would expect. So once we did that, we then worked with our DRPT program managers to engage the transit agencies and work with them on identifying projects that will be realistically implemented over the next 5 years. So adding a little bit more scrutiny and accuracy to these 5-year budgets. And then also we wanted to be clear that these budgets were not intended to be a wish list, but rather a list of capital projects that agencies intend to implement over these 5 years. As Jennifer mentioned earlier, the accuracy had been a bit of a question in years past, so we really wanted to emphasize that this wasn't a wish list, that these were realistic projects that needed to be included in these capital budgets. As we worked with each transit agency, some of them, the more complicated agencies, we We met with them in person and even did some phone calls so that we could get a better understanding of the scope of the projects, what the anticipated funding sources were, and when we expected those to come online. So in particular, as we were looking at these different projects, we wanted to take into consideration a number of characteristics. Obviously, fleet size for each agency. If an agency had, for example, 10 heavy-duty vehicles in their fleet and they were asking for 15 over the next 5 years, we'd have some additional questions for that agency. Additionally, SGR rolling stock replacement schedules. Based on the information that we had in Trans Am, did the year that these projects were programmed make sense from our perspective? Facility conditions also, open and executed grants. If agencies had a bunch of funding for vehicles or facilities, were they asking for the same thing in the next 5 years? And we didn't want agencies to do that. This was only new funding that they were asking for. And then also other planning documents to determine how realistic each project is. So we did take a look at each agency's transit development plan to see if those projects were in there, and if they were, what year were they programmed, and how much did they cost. So if it was determined that the projected costs were either inaccurate or not realistic, staff either reduced the cost or we eliminated the projects from the projected capital budgets. Not to say that we eliminated the need. In most cases, when we did move a project out of the 5-year capital budget, it was that we didn't think that it would be implemented in the 5-year window, that it would be implemented after 5 years. So we did do this for a number of projects, a ton of them. I will say when we worked with the agencies, some costs actually went up for certain projects and some went down. In total, I believe we've reduced the 5-year capital budget by 15%. So we did cut it down a significant amount. And I will...
And if I may, just to highlight that point, I want to emphasize what Grant said, that we're not eliminating the need for the project. We're not saying that we won't fund the project should that application come. This was done purely for coming up with the most conservative estimate of needs that we could. So that's why those changes were made. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that doesn't mean we're not going to fund something if it comes to us.
And before I turn it over to Dan, just one last point. When we went through this, and we're going to talk about anticipated revenues as well and how this all kind of ties together, but we did not apply any project prioritization during this process. We were simply looking at needs versus revenues. So just wanted to point that out.
Chair, if I could ask a process question before we go. I had the question, and then your closing statement about it's not getting rid of the long-term needs in multiple years. So I was kind of curious about, and I don't know what the impact would be for the transit agencies, but we have a 6-year plan, but we're doing a 5-year capital. I know locally I've actually shifted my entire CIP because of transit funding to 6 years, so I didn't have a mix match. And a lot of our regional money is now on a 2-year cycle, so the 6 years was making more sense. And then I've actually added 4 look-ahead years, so I have a 10-year window. So I was wondering if there was any thought process-wise of having a 6-year capital budget that matched the 6-year improvement. That's it.
So when the 6-year plan that we put out in June has the first year is the allocation, and then you have 5 years of projection. So that's how you get to your 6. So we had a 5-year data set to work with.
Right. So the 5 years were 21 was the first year, not 20.
Because that is harder to message when you do it that way than converting everything to a 6 year. So.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to walk you through the results.
All right. Thanks. Is this working?
Yeah. Well, it was for me.
Pointed at the computer?
Got to point it somewhere.
Yeah, sort of.
All right. All right, so I'm going to review the high-level kind of results from the needs assessment that was completed over the last few months, and also examine some of the specifics in relation to historic trends in our capital program. So this slide here shows the large takeaway from our process. It shows that between FY 21 and 25, agencies throughout the state are planning to implement $932 million in capital projects. And this is down from over $1 billion that was in our FY 20 capital budget. These projects will be funded through a combination of federal, state, and local money. And according to this analysis, agencies have programmed a larger number of these bigger ticket items in FY 22, which accounts for that spike. But in general, it's pretty even over time. We do also expect that spike would probably come down and even itself out over the 5 years. But this was the raw data that we got back from them, processed through our kind of methodology. So this chart shows that information, but also takes into account our projected revenues over this period of time. So the needs have been converted into the dotted green line going across the top, which represents the $932 billion. And then the solid colored blocks of bars that make up the rest of the chart represent the anticipated funding. The gray striped bars represent the anticipated shortfall in funding. And so taking into account the projected capital funding over this period of time, we determined that there will be a $208 million shortfall in state-controlled capital funds. And so the state-controlled capital funds, is worth noting, are made up of two large pools of money. One that we're calling state capital funds, it's the blue on these charts. That's money that's allocated from the Mass Transit Trust Fund, and in the past, it also included capital bonds that we had to fund our program. Then the red on here indicates another pool of funds that we're calling state-controlled federal. And those are federal funding streams that the state controls the distribution of. So we use that to help fund capital projects throughout the state. So of that $208 million shortfall, we're anticipating that $187 million of it will be in the state capital funds category, and $21 million will be in the state-controlled federal funds category. A few assumptions had to be made to get to this conclusion. First, we assumed that the grantee-controlled funding, which is illustrated in peach here at the bottom, that's made up of the local match and the locally controlled federal funds. We assumed that that the locals would have the money to implement these projects. And the reason we did that is because when we went out to ask people to update their capital needs, we asked them to only include those projects that were highly anticipated to be implemented and funded over that period of time. So that was a key assumption in this. Another assumption that we made was that the current state match rates and federal funding programs, with the way that we use the federal funding programs, would stay the same as they are today. So we stuck with those match rates that we've used historically. And finally, as Grant said, we did not incorporate the merit capital scoring prioritization process in this. We didn't have enough data to rank each of these projects the way we would if they were actually coming in for funds. But it's worth noting that even if we did apply that, the way that the capital scoring works is that if a project does not get funded in a given year, it doesn't just disappear as a need, it bumps off to a future year. So it's pretty safe to say that these needs would continue moving in the future. Before I advance to the next slide, do you all have any questions on this?
I see on the footnote that you're not adjusting for inflation, makes it more consistent, but since I don't do transit budgeting, is there contingency in the project budget that came in that could cover some of these? We were just talking on the way
Office
down
construction.
about the cost of projects just escalating. So is there contingency, significant contingency in some of this need? Because the shortfall could be bigger.
Yeah, so these are planning level estimates at this point in time, and some of them at this point may take that into account, but in the majority of cases, I would assume that they're just kind of planning estimates of what they will need when they do eventually come in for those projects.
So you guys do planning estimates? Do you put any contingency in there?
We try, but it's like what you're all talking about, it's getting ahead of us.
25-40%.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an estimate for even a small construction project 6 months ago now is off by a significant amount. So
I think it's just a factor that we might need to consider some way of what the shortfall is.
Okay.
You know, one thought is on that question too about the inflation and before I say that too, I just want to say, I think it's really good stuff.
Gets better.
Great. So to take this, you know, it's a small observation, because I don't know that it would really affect the order of magnitude, you know, what you reflected here in the numbers. But with respect to inflation and to the degree to which you did lean into information that agencies were providing, and I'm assuming maybe that with some of the larger numbers that are embedded there, folks, as they've been doing their 6-year plans, have been adjusting for inflation. And so I don't know that matters or not necessarily. But I mean, the way it's written, what you guys have done, it sounds like hasn't done anything additional to account for inflation.
But
that's a good point. May be embedded.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on the project, it's the agency.
Right.
But we didn't have anything applied after the fact.
And Mr. Chair, just, I know you said it, but I'm going to ask to confirm.
Yeah.
This assumes a similar federal program as we have now. Is there any escalation included with that? Okay, so it's assuming a flat line, 20, what our current appropriation is moving forward?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a big uncertainty.
Mhm.
Let's just put that out there. The other thing is how does state-controlled federal, or maybe the bigger question is that we do have the opportunity for transit to compete in smart scale.
Mhm.
How does that play into this or not? And just sort of how does that dynamic work? Because I know that's something that we've talked about.
And we will be talking about major expansion needs and how that was treated. But, and really, I think that has been one reason that some of the needs that we had projected had a material, or I should say there's still needs, but they've been getting funded out of other funds.
That's a good thing.
Which is a good thing. Anyway, I'll let you guys.
Okay.
Yeah, so smart scale funding, as you know, is actually programmed in out years. So for this 5-year budget, if an agency were to come in smart scale round 4 and get funded for a project, it wouldn't even fall in this window. So
Very good point.
So the agencies that identified smart scale funding as a necessary requirement in order to implement that project, we took most of those out.
Very good to know.
One of the things that may happen is that something that's planned for FY23 doesn't come to fruition because they are reliant on the smart scale fund, so it will get bumped out.
Okay, great.
So there, I mean, it's a give and take.
Yep. No, thank you.
That might be a good footnote,
Okay.
Yeah.
unless I can persuade you all to do it and look ahead.
We get good data from agencies who would. Yeah.
I can look for my data.
In fact, 5 years. And now, and just even the dynamic of smart scale coming in there, so it becomes squishier numbers as you go further out, so we just have to be.
And I will, one of the things, I mean, in the previous needs assessment that we had done, we actually did a fair amount of extrapolation to look out to 10 years. And I do think that actually contributed to perhaps the sort of the magnitude of the needs that we had that were much larger than what we were actually seeing.
Yeah.
And so I think the shorter time period and really being able to scrub the data gives us a much, and it's still a stark picture. I mean, we'll keep going through this, but I think the 5-year window alone, I think, is pretty, we feel better that this is really, really good data that we can stand behind.
Be good data, not bootstrap.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So as I mentioned, this slide kind of summarizes the overall takeaway of this analysis. The next slide kind of context, which is history on our program, to give us a better idea of kind of where we came from to get to this point. And just to orient you to this graph here, the solid blue bars are past revenue. The solid green line is past allocations. The striped blue bars are projected revenues, and the dotted green line is projected allocations, or represented by the needs that our agencies told us. And so the large takeaway from this slide over here on the right is that over the next 5 fiscal years, there will be a $187 billion shortfall in capital funds, or state capital funds, not the state-controlled federal, state capital funds. To satisfy this shortfall, we will need an additional $38 million per year over 5 years. Okay? So that's the big takeaway on that program, but it is also interesting to see how these projections kind of compare to our recent past over the past 10 years. So from FY 11 to 18, WMATA was included in our capital program. The capital revenues and allocations over that period of time were on an upward trend through FY18. I mean, it jumps back and forth, but generally on an upward trend until the General Assembly approved of the 53.5% funding for WMATA, which brought our revenues down significantly. The total that we've allocated to our capital program has decreased over the past 2 years. But starting in FY21 and continuing through 25, the total amount of state revenues are expected to be much lower than they have even in the last 2 fiscal years. And so those are the overall takeaways looking at the history of this. I'm happy to take any questions on this slide as well if you have any at this time. If not, the next couple, which give a little bit more background on how we look at that solid blue line.
Any questions?
All right. So this chart illustrates where our revenues came from over the past 10 years and 50 years. Again, to orient you to the graph, the dark blue is money received from the capital assistance MTTF fund, the Mass Transit Trust Fund. There's a light blue small line in the middle there that represents paratransit assistance. It's a specific $1.5 million that we get a year to go towards capital investments in paratransit. In FY11, it's the only fiscal year that had this. There was a little bit of money that we still had in our program from the state transit trust fund or transportation trust fund, and then the green, which accounted for a large part of our program over years, of the capital bonds. The main 2 sources of revenue, as I said, were the capital assistance carve-out at 12.5% from the MTTF funds and capital bonds over the past 10 years. As mentioned on the previous slide, the reason why our program was so much larger before was that the WMATA capital funding was included, so we needed to increase our funding to support that. And so here, I'll go through these. In FY19, the MTTF WMATA funding was taken out of our capital program, which accounts for that jump down. In FY19 and 20, there was still a significant amount of carryover from the change in our program, but also a lot of de-obligated funds, which we'll get to on the next slide, that came back into our program that kept our capital program well funded. And then in FY20, we anticipate that the capital bonds and the carryover will be depleted moving forward. Any questions on this one?
I can just say, I really appreciate having this. Many of us just passed our legislative agendas. This would have been really great to have before we pass our legislative agendas, but this is really great because we can put it in our fact sheets in advance.
So this slide, I don't think this group has ever looked at this exactly this way. This slide represents carryover balances and de-obligated and other revenues that have come back into the capital program over the past 10 years. The dark blue here is the carryover, and the light blue is what we're calling other, but it's mostly de-obligations. I'll click through these as well. In FY19 and 20, the capital carryover grew to all-time highs in our program. In FY20, it grew a bit higher because there was a $21 million de-obligation of capital bonds that came back into the program. In FY21, however, the balance is now down to $24.2 million for state capital. We ended up allocating a lot of it last year, partially through the large capital major expansion applications that we got. And in FY22, we're anticipating that the carryover balance will be depleted. And so there is one thing to note here that we cannot really anticipate for the future, and it's that de-obligated amount coming back in each year. We don't know the exact amount that will come back in, but it is highly unlikely that we'll see anything like we did in FY18 or 20 with $20 million coming back.
The obligation of grants.
Yes, yeah. So those are grants that were allocated to an agency that never ended up getting spent or just expired.
So that money just goes back into the program in the next year. So when we bug your transit agencies about the status of these grants, that's why.
And we did a lot of programmatic cleanup of grants that had expired, but the money was just still sitting on them because we hadn't done the paperwork exercise between the transit agency and us in fiscal 18, 19, and then when you get into 20, you get some of that WMATA program transition in there as well. But there was a lot of work that was done to clean that up, and we're trying to make sure that we all collectively stay on top of that going forward. That funding gets back into the program and fund projects in our.
And just to take that a little bit further, because you guys did such a deep scrub in those 2-3 fiscal years, it's unlikely we would see that huge trend in the future, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah, that's good. I mean, you're on top of that stuff. Reason is, it's not like we're going to find the change in the couch cushions anymore. You kind of found it.
Cleaned out the couch cushion.
That's what I.
But when I come in and I log on my login screen to the RPT, it tells me how many expired projects are still sitting out there. And that number has come down.
Right, but that's important in the messaging of this.
Yes.
You guys did an incredible job in the obligating and cleaning up, but it's not like we're going to be able to do that in the future.
Correct.
Or see that result in the future, I should say.
Now, if big projects that were allocated funds get canceled or don't move forward, then that could account for other money coming in.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want that to happen.
No. What projects?
But you're also going to see us being a little bit harder on things like extensions and, projects that kind of linger on the books for a long time and don't move forward, because we want that money back in the program and generating a project that it's intended to do.
All right, moving on. So as this group knows very well, starting in FY20, the capital assistance projects that we receive are sorted into 3 different project type categories. Those are state of good repair, replacement and rehabilitation projects. There's minor enhancements. Those are expansion projects that are worth less than $2 million, or that include a vehicle expansion of 5 vehicles or 5% of the fleet or less. And then major expansions that are expansion projects that are worth more than $2 million, or if they're vehicle expansions of more than 5 vehicles or more than 5% of the fleet. And so when breaking our programs down into these project types, we can see that the greatest shortfall will actually impact the state of good repair and minor enhancement side of our program, more so than the major expansion side. And this is calculated, so our state policy currently states that a minimum of 80% of our yearly allocation needs to go towards SGR and minor enhancement projects, and a maximum of 20% towards major expansions. And so applying these limits, we were able to determine how much money we would have, or that would be available in each of those categories. When we compare those revenues to the needs, we found that there will be a $177 million shortfall in the SGR, minor enhancement category, and a $10 million shortfall on the major side. Now, one other point here is that our program does have some flexibility in it, that we can take those major funds and shift them over to the SGR and minor enhancement side. But this version of these charts shows that even if we do that, we would still have a $138 million shortfall on the SGR minor enhancement side, shortfall. Are there any questions about what the one for?
I assume state of good repair is a majority of its rolling stock. One of the reasons for some of our de-obligation for FY20 was overestimation of the cost of rolling stock. Just based on past trends, we thought the cost would be higher, but they weren't. I don't know if we're trying to dive into that, because I know our 5-year planning, we just assumed the trend would continue without realizing that, well, just taking into account maybe FY20 was an odd year, but it could be worth assessing if there are a trend in the cost of rolling stock that the agency are accounting for. They're just taking maybe a straight line trend instead of a.
We have vehicles on state contracts for an extended period of time, and so those are generally a good indicator of cost. It doesn't necessarily account for all of the options and things that a transit agency might want to add to that vehicle, but we've got costs locked in for a specific period of time. So we defer to the transit agency on their estimate of that, but we know what a baseline expectation is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, our checking is more been on the number of buses that were going to be replaced or purchased, not necessarily on the exact cost that's applied to each of them. But we could take it into account to adjust anything.
Y'all do enough work for this clearly. Yeah, looking at this, that makes me think just look internally. I'll let you know if I see anything.
And I think when we changed the merit last year, we tried to make sure that we impressed more folks. We didn't want people applying for replacement buses here and fare boxes over here and cameras over here. When you apply for that bus, it needs to be the bus plus everything to make it go in revenue operations. And so, because we wanted to get away from all these little bits and pieces that are tied together and honestly holding up projects moving forward. And so that's going to impact how much some of those vehicles, what the vehicle prices or what those grants are in the future, because we're putting more into those grants than what we did in the past.
One thing I do want to point out, and this gets back to the discussion about smart scale, is these two graphs are not to scale. You can see the numbers for major expansion are, it's a much, much smaller pot of money going forward. And as a result, I mean, I think it's very clear, our capital program is not going to be able to support big project applications. We've known that for a long time. That's always been the case where you've got a $200 million project, you're getting a little bit of it maybe out of transit capital, but you're probably, there's other sources of funds such as smart scale or federal funds that we need to use. So I do want to just make sure that that's clear, underscored to everybody too, that to the degree that Hampton Roads has some big projects in the works, there's some in Northern Virginia that are looking for opportunities as well. But this is not going to be the pot of money that's going to support projects like that. So.
And if I could, just to amplify that we all need to be very mindful of the futures of any of those programs, whether it be from Smart Scale or the federal, because if those are the places we're going to be looking for transit capital, we make sure that those programs are shored up. So it is definitely part of the bigger picture.
Again, it's really good stuff. A question that I had is looking at slide 9, and as you shared, just trying to follow along, like you guys started by really engaging with agencies and understanding within, folks' 6-year plan. My assumption is that, those 6-year programs were built under cost-constrained assumptions, including commitments of state funding. Sure. And so then, as you guys move through your process, I'm just wondering, are there like red flags then? Like, I think this information is very, very good on the near term, especially with upcoming session, et cetera. But beyond that, do agencies now, are there red flags? You're like, oh, okay, folks, you guys really need to go back, totally update your assumptions because if it's true that the starting place was constrained plans and including assumptions about the reliability of state funding. Do folks need to go back and really scrub and update their 6-year plans based on this?
Yeah, I mean, we hope that this process was the first step in that. But moving forward, the idea is that we'll be much more engaged with the agencies as they develop those projections, and we'll likely give more parameters and more guidance on what we want to see. I don't know if either of you have
I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot, we've spent a lot of time together in the last several weeks getting this to where it is today, is if you put the need off because you're constrained, the need doesn't go away. So if you reduce those bars, because we had a conversation about that little peak in 22, do you push that down? Well, if you push that down, everything else goes up. So if agencies are constraining their list, the need doesn't go away, it just moves it further out. And so we tried to stay with what the agencies told us, but if they're constraining those before they get to us and there are more needs, I would like a suggestion on where we identify those or how we identify those. Did I get?
Well, I'm trying to follow along because, like with our 6-year program, I know that the constrained program based on the best assumptions that we can realistically have about the reliability of funding over the 6-year window. There's also a long list of unmet needs that just didn't make it in there because through prioritization. So.
And I think that when we did this a couple of years ago, we used the TDPs, and the TDPs they feel more unconstrained. They should be a little bit constrained, but they were a lot broader with a lot more information. This is a much more constrained look because we're looking at a shorter period of time. But as last month at your commission, Brian, I mean, you guys did a great job of explaining what you could do and what you couldn't do with what you had available. And so I think trying to find that balance, the state funding is a piece of it, but you've got to have access to federal and you've got to have access to local. And so the discussion doesn't stop and end here. It's a broader discussion of how do you fund transit in communities.
And if this analysis included the unconstrained needs, I mean, the deficit or the shortfall would be much, much greater. But we tried to keep this pulled out to the reality of what people would actually ask for over these 5 years, especially given the fact that we haven't necessarily even gotten that accurate in the past.
So just a final point then on that. So to keep it realistic to what people actually ask for, and then that translates to this information on slide 9, right? That realistically people would be asking for, everything, look at FY 22, SGS, essentially 80 or somewhere between 80 and 100 million, but in reality, actually this is just the state funding, right?
So yeah, this is the state capital fund,
Okay.
the MTTA.
So this is what people would be expecting based on their realistic, project plan,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a deficit.
Yes.
Yeah. We can't refer to this as a cliff.
It's more of a step down.
It's still troubling.
Yeah.
Just because I'm really like trying to do the math here. Is there I can visually see, it looks like about a 50% or a 40. Do you have a number of like what we are asking and what the loss is as a percentage? Just because I'm having a hard time visually looking at that.
A little bit more after this, though.
Okay, great.
It's into that. So probably put a pin in that.
What that percentage is
Yes.
compared to the total?
Yes.
I mean, you can visually see it. I don't have it.
You don't have, okay.
We can get
I mean, you can, yeah, we can calculate that very easily.
So really, no prioritization has been applied to this.
So can I ask a question about the projects that were essentially eliminated because they hadn't been spent? Do they then appear in future capital, or are they projects that just go away?
If it's a need, if it's something that the transit agency decided not to move forward with, say now, but they want to do it in the future, it would show back up in their capital.
Mm-hmm.
Some projects were originally listed in FY 21 or 22. If our program managers didn't think it was realistic for them to be implemented that quickly, we bring them out to 23 to 25. So
Right. I was just wondering about what that means in terms of the notion that we're recovering funds, but then will that also result in future years in increased requests?
Potentially.
yeah. I'll flip through this.
Yeah, a little bit more.
And one more point on the shortfall. We did a side project, just looking at the history of the FTA bus no discretionary programs to see how competitive Virginia has been in those programs for 4 years. Especially with bus and bus facilities, we were in the bottom quarter of all the states. I mean, we were with Kansas, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana. Nothing against those, but it was kind of shocking when we kind of added up the totals for each state and saw where we landed. So
Is that failed applications or lack of applying?
it was the awards.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's also.
But do we know how many people actually applied? And that's,
I don't
if
think
you don't
we have-
play, you
I
don't
think
win,
we
right?
have that.
We try every year, ask our program managers to talk with their transit systems about, like, are you aware that this is now,
Right.
SNOFO is out there, please apply. And I would say, just the anecdotal feedback I've been getting is that we haven't been getting a lot of applications from Virginia Systems for those federal programs, which I think is something we need to push people to do more of.
Yeah.
And we also know because we usually try to write letters of support for applications or get them to our congressional delegation. So we have a sense of when people are applying for those programs, but we maybe get one or two.
I would say 1 or 2.
Yeah, not many.
We're going to put more emphasis on our end.
Right.
Instead of going and saying, this is out there, you should apply, we'll write you a letter of support, we're going to push a little harder and say, this is out here, we'll help you apply.
Right.
And we've done 2 discretionary applications, one in process and one that was done. We did an integrated mobility application with 2 rural transit systems. We also helped the Northern Virginia, the other end, the NB.
It was MBTA.
Was it MBTA? Not
NBDC.
Not the Alliance.
not the Alliance.
Yeah.
Right, the authority.
But we worked on an application with them that we supported and we submitted on their behalf, and we also did an application for IMI for some autonomous work that we're working on too. So we're trying to be more active. We're working on stuff now for Mobility for All, but we're gonna try to do our part to help from the technical assistance side to encourage people to apply. And we're even looking at maybe do we package stuff together on the rural side, because we've seen some states that have big rural programs that have been successful by putting groups of projects together and applying for them as a package. So we're going to do our part to try to maximize that federal program look ourselves. But it was shocking when we sat down and really thought about it that we're not bringing those dollars back to Virginia like we should.
And I know, just to speak for a lot of the Northern Virginia providers, they have a policy decision that WMATA will be the federal provider and that they will not federalize their system to provide them a little bit of relief from, various federal regulations. So that is a strategic decision that will need to continue to be there. They will make that decision whether they decide to federalize their program or not. But that,
I think that we need to be cognizant of that.
yeah,
When we look at the statewide program, that there are systems that will not ever seek federal funding.
right.
I just think that makes it even more important that the systems that do seek federal funding actually go out and apply for those discretionary programs. When you look at just the overall pool collectively of what we all have to support.
And bus facilities is an 80% federal,
Yeah.
right?
So we have a little bit more to get through, and then but I do think that we should spend some time talking about the overall picture and implications.
All right, slide 11 here. So this is similar to what we just looked at for state capital funds. This is for state-controlled federal funds. This chart illustrates the historic trend and also the projections moving forward. To orient you to the graph, the solid red, past allocation or past revenues. The solid teal is past allocations, and then the dotted and striped is the future going forward. So over the past 10 years, state-controlled federal revenues and allocations have been much steadier compared to our state funds. Over the past 2 years, the available funds have grown to be significantly higher than the allocations in those years. Moving forward, however, the available revenues are expected to be lower than they were over the past 2 fiscal years at least. So unless there is a large change in federal law or policy, we don't expect the revenues coming in any of these funding streams to change significantly over the next 5 years, which means that the shortfall in these programs can only be made up by either state funds or local funds. And since many of the local agencies that rely on these often don't, they have a hard time increasing their local contributions, they will likely turn to the state to try to pick up some of this shortfall. And so the takeaway here is on the right side is that over the next 5 fiscal years, there will be a $21 million shortfall in state-controlled federal. We saw that a little earlier, and that translates to a $4 million a year increase that would be needed to satisfy that. Any other questions on this one? And so I don't think I mentioned this. The state-controlled federal includes flexible STP, FTA 5311 funds, some 5339 that we receive from the feds, and also a small amount from the ADTAP program, which is a Appalachian Development Program. We did not include 5310 in here because that's not part of the same process. All right, so slide 12 gives you the high-level takeaways from this. I know we just went over a ton of history, looking at charts that illustrated that history over time, but what we are projecting moving forward is agencies like the state will capital projects, taking into account current match levels and the projected revenues that we'll have. There will be a $208 million shortfall in state-controlled capital funds. That's $187 million in state capital, the majority of which we saw would fall to the SGR and minor enhancements category. And then there would be a $21 million shortfall in state-controlled federal. And so to address that shortfall, we would need a total annual addition of $42 million a year. So that is all we have. I think we can discuss some of this. Are there any additional questions?
I think as you've heard, everybody around the table feels this is really very, very useful information and tremendously helpful in terms of trying to make the case. I guess I would just wonder whether there's a possibility of because I think there is so much detail here, of producing a final slide that maybe focuses on that total 42 million, as opposed to all the individual pieces that create it. That would be something handy to.
Yeah, that's kind of what the first one, but I agree it could probably be.
Maybe that reflects all these different pieces as part of that graph.
That's kind of the big.
Something based on this.
Yes, right, right.
Mr. Chair, all of these are up on the website already? Or they will be shortly? Okay, good. The other thing is the loaded question. So would we anticipate seeing anything in the governor's budget that may help address this, or do we need to be working other legislative strategies?
I anticipate whether it's going to be in the budget or not.
Or in a legislative package?
Yeah, I believe there will be some legislation moving forward and I mentioned the broader issues that are out there regarding transportation, but that would likely affect this picture or hopefully affect this picture.
Okay.
But I will say that it's, it does paint a pretty stark picture though about that. And like I said, I think for me, the most eye-opening part of this was, because we've had these big balances for so many years, it's been really tough to make the case to anybody that we actually have needs that are going to be outstripping our revenues. When these guys really went back and broke down how much of that had been carryover and de-obligations and the way that we saw how that had really propped up our program for so many years. And, but that is about to be depleted. Mm-hmm. And so it helps me and I think others, hopefully, to be able to talk about this in a way that, our program was sort of artificially inflated for a long time, but given where we are today, and the WMATA has changed this picture somewhat too, we are seeing that deficit coming up in, if not next year, then the year after.
Right.
So it's right. But this was really, seeing that picture, those blue bars and how that carryover really made the picture to me a lot clearer about, not just the fact that we hadn't been receiving the applications that we expected, but also there was a lot of carryover in our program that was propping us up. So with that said, though, I do think that, we want to address this. I expect there will be some legislative proposals that will help address this, but clearly it's going to need a lot of coordination and support.
I guess 3 points. One, thank you, because it is good data. That's number one. Two, I was thinking of Brian's points and slide 11's points that the shortfall is going to come back to the state. Safety, obviously, given my role here. But then I think, too, as we roll out this data and whatever we do legislatively and with the budget, we need to brand this something else. Because if anybody says, jumping off the cliff.
Let's not talk about cliff anymore.
So
structural deficit.
Yeah, it's a new name and a rebranding because immediately people will stop listening. So, and this good data helps set the stage much better.
Right.
Well, if I think about the messaging, previously it was only about the exhaustion of the funding under the bonds. This is, as you said, a structural sustainability in terms of revenues meeting the needs. And so it's we'll have to figure out how we message that.
Yeah. So the blue bar is also, that tells a lot of the story.
Yeah.
The bonds will never expire.
Yeah. The sustainability is good, and it'll tie into the economic development piece, I'm sure, when we get to that, because structural deficit will still not resonate with.
I'm open to other terms. Yeah, but essentially, I think that's what it is. It's the bonds going away, but also just the, like I said, we just had a lot of other carryover that was kind of affecting and propping up the program for a long time, somewhat falsely, I think, that made it look like we had all of these, unobligated balances that just, almost like, do we have too much funding? That's what people were saying.
And I think that's a good thing to own and acknowledge and say, going forward, this is really much short up. We've cleaned up the house. swept under the sofa and the cushions.
And I think that's also important for us to be able to say, this does not include a bunch of wish list projects that are, new BRT lines or LRT lines. We know that those can't be supported out of this program. We're assuming they're going to be picked up somewhere else. But this is just the bread and butter, state of good repair needs, some expansion needs as well, but the majority of it really is state of good repair.
That was the kind of thing I was thinking about too, and then there's a lot of work to do moving forward, and like just the messaging and all of that. But to me, that's one of those areas that's a little concerning, is the definition of needs, I guess, and how because this would be just to meet basic needs, because there's certainly those lists of unmet needs, and not that aren't the necessarily wish list type big stuff, but like there's some basic improvements we'd like to be able to do, but the 6-year program itself, as far as from an agency perspective, I think or I should say that the applications to draw down on state funds is a reflection of the capacity to do that by leveraging other funds. So at some point you run out of other funds to be able to leverage, but I think that's part of it too. We need to be thinking about supporting, fixing, and a focus here is certainly on the state, but also, how can we enhance the capacities at the local and regional level in order to be able to,
are y'all going to present this to any other groups, meaning BTA and?
You guys are the first. So we literally, and I'm somewhat kidding, but we were still working on this up till yesterday afternoon. It's a lot of work has gone into this. These guys have done a great job.
Very worthwhile.
Yeah, so it's, but no, we're obviously, this is something that we would like to be able to talk about in the General Assembly, maybe not to this level of detail, but I'm sure there are some people, whether it's staff or others, that we may be able to go into this level of detail with, but we'll have to kind of take the messaging up a notch, I think. But no, this is definitely something we will be presenting and out there talking about. Happy to.
What about the MPOs? Presenting at the MPOs on this?
Yeah.
Just because I know typically their long-range transportation plans kind of marginalize transit.
Yeah.
At least in my opinion.
Yeah.
So we had to reschedule that MPO webinar, so we could add a couple slides. It's next week, so that's a good point.
And likewise, we just had 120 people at our legislative briefing on Monday. I'm going to want to see if we can package something to get back out to these folks, because this would be really important for us to be able to share on Monday. So.
But again, I think big picture, as I mentioned before, the overall sustainability, funding sustainability initiative, I think will really hopefully address, we'd like this to address, but I think part of that discussion may be for us, kind of collectively as the transit community, to talk about, how do we make the case to get a bigger share of it, not just a bigger pie, but a bigger share of it, if that's possible. So. Okay. Now there's some good news though that's coming up about the economic impact of that. So.
As we shift to that, Chair, could I just ask one clarification? There's a one-page of numbers that looks very helpful. Just a quick comment on what we have here in the packet.
So I can speak to that a little bit. Those are the underlying figures that were behind a lot of the charts that we looked at. Yeah, so the process of going through this needs assessment created huge spreadsheets that we had to create summaries based on. And so, some of those figures, especially on the right column, you'll recognize from the major figures. Especially down in the bottom right, I think you'll see the 208 figure. Yeah. Yeah.
And not all the spreadsheets.
So I think the last time we met as a group, we mentioned that we were working on an economic impact of transit study. with Cambridge Systematics, and this was specific to the Commonwealth of Virginia. As you all probably know, there have been studies done at the national level by APTA on the economic impact of transit. I think there was even a study done in Northern Virginia, but we haven't done one on the full Commonwealth, at least in a while. So we wanted to do this as we prepare for the legislative session. So the study's purpose is kind of self-explanatory, but it's to illustrate how existing public transit services and operations in the Commonwealth of Virginia generate economic value. So the findings were summarized in two different ways. One, it monetized the economic and social benefits of the presence of transit. So it put a value on congestion relief, increased and affordable mobility, sustainability, safety, and state of good repair of the roadway infrastructure. We'll dig a little bit more into each of these in just a minute. And then the second way we summarized the findings was to show the impact on different economic indicators. So jobs, income, GSP, which is gross state product, and tax revenue.
Yeah, you might need to come out of it.
Okay. Very briefly, just giving you an overview of the methodology used in this study. First was just to collect data. We did that on the highway side and on the transit side, and Cambridge Systematics helped us with this. On the highway side, we looked at vehicle miles traveled, vehicle hours traveled, average delay, and then on the transit side, we provided data to Cambridge on ridership, passenger miles traveled, revenue hours, revenue miles, and then they crunched the average trip distance, average trip time, passenger hours traveled. I do want to mention all the data that we used was from FY18. This was the most recent data that we had scrubbed up until this point. So once we did the data collection, we were then able to do the travel efficiency analysis, which monetized user benefits, it monetized social benefits, and then it gave us the ability to estimate the annual cost savings for each category. So again, putting a value on congestion relief, travel time savings, putting a value on increased mobility, sustainability, so we're talking emission savings, gas usage savings, safety, so reduced crashes, and state of good repair of the roadway infrastructure, which is essentially by putting people in a bus as opposed to a car, there is an impact there on roadway infrastructure and the time that you got to replace that infrastructure. So the third and final step, once we were able to quantify the benefits, we were then able to run an economic impact analysis, and this was the very complicated model that Cambridge helped us run. So using all of the values from step 2, we then allocated those values to different jobs by industry type, households, industry sectors, and fed all of this through an in-plan economic model, which is pretty complicated economic model. We have a 100-page methodology which describes this thing. Very, very complex, but we'll be sharing that if you're interested. And then the output from the in-plan economic model was to show the economic impact that transit has on jobs in the Commonwealth. Jobs can be attributed to transit, the income generated from those jobs, the gross state product, and then the tax revenues collected due to the presence of transit. So that was the methodology. This is just a quick overview of the ridership data that we provided Cambridge. And we threw this up here just to kind of give you an idea of how important the MATA is to the Commonwealth, and definitely congestion, obviously reduction in Virginia. But almost 63% of the ridership in Virginia is because of the WMATA services and the presence of the services. And then 37% comes from all of the other agencies. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dan, which is going to he's going to walk through the all the benefits of transit.
Right, I get to do the fun stuff. These next two slides illustrate the high-level results of step 2 that Grant just described, which is the economic and social benefits that transit brings to the state. So the total monetized benefit that we are reporting here is $2.5 billion, and that comes from specific savings in the following 5 categories. There's 3 here and 2 on the following slide. So in the congestion relief category, transit provides $624 million in benefits in highway travel time savings. This is people using transit instead of getting on the roadway, and that's based on an estimate $23.5 million in hours of travel time saved because of the existence of transit. In addition, in the congestion relief category, it provides $66 million in benefits based on faster commute times in certain areas of the state, Some systems, so like WMATA and BRE, can actually account for faster commute times than than auto travel, which is pretty unique to the Northern Virginia region. The total there is about $700 million in that category. In terms of increase and affordable mobility, transit brings a benefit of $305 million generated based on net transportation cost savings. This is money that would otherwise be spent to purchase vehicles, operate and maintain them, or to use other modes such as taxi or Uber. And it also, in this category, brings $1.5 billion in benefits in the form of income for transit users. So this represents income that would be foregone if transit was not available. It mostly captures those lower income employees that would not necessarily be afforded to commute to work if transit wasn't enough. And then in the traffic safety category, transit brings a $60 million benefit in the form of reduced crashes due to less driving on the road. In the sustainability category, we are estimating that transit brings a savings of $12.8 billion in emissions reduction and provides $3.5 million in fuel consumption savings. So this fuel consumption savings is a little bit of a complicated measure. This measure actually looks at the reduced demand for fuel, leading to overall lower prices for fuel in the state. It's not just based on less purchased fuel. That would actually be more captured over here in the transportation cost savings category. And then finally, in the state of roadway infrastructure, transit provides a modest $400,000 investment attributed to less wear and tear on roads.
And real quick, these are annual figures from 2018.
So the annual benefit to cost ratio that we've determined based on this analysis is $2.17. That's like saying every dollar of public investment in transit generates $2.17 in direct statewide benefits. And that is a function of the total benefits, those are the monetized direct benefits, $2.5 billion, divided by total public cost. And total public cost was determined by looking at the expenses from the agencies less fare revenues and advertising and parking and other revenues coming in to identify just what the public investment was in transit throughout the state.
And just to clarify, when you mean public, that can be all sources of public funding.
Federal, state, local. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so that's the first big takeaway. The next part of this is using the in-plan model to generate some results on the impact to these larger economic indicators statewide. And so when it comes to measuring that impact, we found that transit supports 28,940 jobs throughout the state. Those jobs account for $1.9 billion in labor income, which generates $3.5 billion in gross state product or economic activity, and brings back $607 million in tax revenue each year. We're in FY18. Okay, looking at those categories a little bit closer. So those categories of economic activity mostly influenced by these 3 categories here. These are enterprise effects. That's the effects due to direct spending by transit agencies. congestion relief and what that brings to the state, and increased and affordable mobility. The number of jobs impacted by each of these categories is really the driver of the rest of the indicators that follow. So to zoom in a little bit on each of these, the model output said that enterprise efforts account for approximately 18,280 jobs. And those are direct jobs, so those are agency employees and contractors that work for agencies. Indirect jobs are supported by incentives to spending, employees of companies that provide auto parts or fuel. And then induced jobs, which refers to jobs in other sectors that are supported by the spending of those direct and indirect employees. So those could be in the service industry or various other industries. The congestion relief impact on jobs is a little bit harder to wrap our heads around. So this is jobs that would be foregone due to increased highway congestion if transit was not an option. And so the model has told us that accounts for about 1,445 jobs at the state. And finally, in the increased and affordable mobility category, this 9,215 jobs reflects jobs that would be foregone if employees did not have transit to travel to and from work. So that accounts for the totals across the bottom. Are then a kind of a function of those jobs in each category. So you'll recognize this next slide, but it is actually reported a little bit different. This is looking at the annual return on investment, which was determined to be $2.91. This is like saying that for every dollar of public investment, again, in transit, we generate $2.91 of economic activity statewide. And that's based on the total benefits, which here is reported as sort of state product, which is $3.5 billion divided by 2. So both of those figures are interesting to report on. This is the larger takeaway from the study, is that the overall economic activity generated by every dollar is $3. So in addition, the final report will also include some content outside of the qualitative economic benefits that are associated with the continued investment in transit throughout the state. Those will be summarized as property value benefits, benefits to health and social services, benefits to the built environment, fiscal benefits, and economic development benefits that kind of allow us to attract new employers to the state based on the presence of transit. And so this presentation, as mentioned, it highlights the preliminary results of this study. Over the next few weeks, we are going to do continued quality checks to make sure that all of our model outputs make sense and all of the outputs are what we're comfortable moving forward with. But the timeline for deliverables on this is that we want to have a one-page economic impacts sheet by January 10th to use during the legislative session, and the final report and summary in February. So the two of these together, this analysis and the needs assessment, go well together to make the argument for what transit provides to the state and what our need is moving forward. Yeah.
So I guess a couple things. One's I mentioned page 9, and as you pointed out, the total public cost there, that's all funding, and so that's how you get the ratio. But maybe if the interest is to particularly be able to show the value from a state perspective, when Virginia is investing in transit, you're getting good return on investment, and I don't know, maybe a ratio that left out the federal support or other funding as well. That would show, what's the bang for the buck just from a state perspective.
Kind of the benefits generated by each dollar of state investment.
Yeah.
We discussed doing that. The economist's general recommendation in this is to keep it all together because each of those sources of funds are kind of dependent on one another. You don't necessarily get that level of state funding if you don't have the local match or the federal match to leverage. But we could certainly do it that way. I don't know how think about it.
So that was just a thought on that. And, I would say just on first blush, it seems to me like some of these numbers are lower than what we thought they would be. And like, for example, on page 8 with maintenance savings, I don't know. I a lot about what's happening in other parts of, with other agencies and all, but I'm thinking about VRE, for example. I think that's one of the talking points is how, you know, if you didn't have VRE, you would have another lane or two of highways, you know, that was not required to move that many people. I mean, so, you know, I think this is good stuff. You know, it's important to be able to monetize benefits and talk about them because they can really make a strong case, you know, when you're trying to make a case for the value of transit. I think the devil's in the details. You know, there's a lot of ways, you know, and I'm curious to, and you mentioned here the in-plan economic model, you know, did they also use a TREDIS model with the in-plan, or was it just a straight in-plan model?
Just a straight in-plan model.
Okay, and that was, you know, gets a little bit more in the weeds, but that's an example where you can really get into the weeds a lot of different ways when you're talking about, you know, doing these kind of analysis. And then, you know, we've done some of that at HRT a couple of years ago. You know, we had the benefit of doing an economic impact study, and which used the TREDIS models in plan and TREDIS. And so like the job numbers, other numbers, it was we feel very positive, you know, about the methodology, the outcomes, and everything. Like it was well done. Economic Development Research Group out of Boston was the firm who did that research. And so we kind of stand behind those numbers. That's an example where I think an agency has spent time, I think, trying to, you know, do our part to communicate about the value of transit with our key audiences and so forth. And others have done that very much in their respective areas as well. And to the degree that there, you know, are differences, like we might confuse people in some cases more than help if we are, you know, not, I guess, on the same page in a way with how we're talking about the economic benefits. Like in the HRT case, for example, and it was at a time when ridership was higher than it is today, so we can certainly adjust for those kinds of things. But our results show that HRT supports about 20,000 jobs and a significant amount of more economic activity in terms of employment income. And we like to talk about those things. Sure. So I just can, you know, again, I guess overall it surprised me that maybe the numbers are a little bit small, it seemed to me. But again, the devil's in the details. It's all about the model you're using and the inputs. And there's so many things you have to build into your assumptions and all that. And I understand that too. And you got to be true to that. Whatever your methodology is, you got to be true to that. You plug the numbers in, and the model puts out what it puts out, and you got to live with that because that's the I think, you know, important. There's a lot of moving parts to this kind of analysis. So.
I was going to speak to this. I'll put on the old highway hat for a second. We had a lot of debate about that maintenance savings number because we all thought it was going to be higher too. It doesn't capture what you said about VRE. And the fact that VRE wasn't there, you would need another lane. This isn't capturing the additional capacity that would be needed if we don't have transit. What this is capturing is the cost of maintaining the roadway infrastructure that's there is less because we have transit. And so we talked about it as it compares to some studies on the rail side, and on the rail side, it's taking heavy trucks completely off the road. This is taking cars and putting heavy vehicles on the road, but fewer of them. So
it's a little counterintuitive, but some of those transportation benefits are also captured in the congestion relief. So this did not go, okay, well, what would we do? How many lanes of highways would we have to accommodate all of that? It really was capturing that more as what would the additional impacts of congestion be if we didn't have transit.
Right, and I also like to add, these are net benefits. So transit, obviously, there's some emissions with diesel vehicles. Obviously, we take that into account. So we take that off the top. Same with maintenance savings. A bus does produce wear and tear on roadways, just not as much as, you know, all of the vehicles. So we took that into account, and our consultants did note that possibly some other similar studies have only done the benefits, not the net benefits. Hence why some other studies are a little bit higher, have higher numbers.
And some of the stuff that you all mentioned, though, will be captured in the qualitative benefits that were described there. I know that I think y'all were planning to pull some or report on some information that's been captured elsewhere by others about some of those benefits that aren't necessarily captured earlier.
Mr. Chair, if I could go, really nice job this and the capital needs assessment. I know you guys have been incredibly hard at work. I'm like delighted to dive into this. When it comes to the needs assessment, again, yeah, we've done a little bit of stuff, different methodology in Northern Virginia. It's looking apples and oranges. I have no reason to compare. Is there any way that any of this can be, like, dive in, looking at the data to pull it out regionally, or is this best work as a statewide analysis?
We are doing it somewhat regionally. So we're breaking it down by Northern Virginia urban areas. Then we're splitting between urban and rural throughout the rest of the state.
I look forward to talking to you about that. Thank you.
We're not there yet because it's a preliminary result.
No, this is fantastic. This is
I personally think the statewide numbers are a little more compelling.
sure.
There may be audiences in Northern Virginia where it's important, but really to look at the impact statewide, especially when you look at the impact of statewide tax revenue,
Right.
I think is really where it's important to kind of look at the whole
Right.
statewide picture together as a single number.
Absolutely.
I had a couple of quick questions about it. One is, when you are talking about revenue, is it state tax revenue, or state and local, state, local, and federal?
Oh, the tax revenue.
Yes.
You know,
Because certainly you could argue.
I'm not sure. I think it's total, actually.
Okay.
I think it's total because it's based on the GSP.
Okay.
But
That's actually, so that's, when we did our analysis, we purposely only looked at state revenue, knowing that a lot of times property tax can get, thrown in that, and that's a local thing. So that'll be a really good thing to clarify what that is.
And certainly the increased property taxes around metro stops.
Right, so our $600 million a year was completely absent of the property tax stuff. It was literally what goes down to the general fund that can be shared across the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So.
And the other question I had was whether your data would allow you to do anything about addressing the incremental impact of spending on transit, whether it would allow you to see whether additional spending would produce higher ratios or not. I don't know if it's going to be data, but
I'm not sure if the model that we're using would allow.
got these great consultants who can.
This is taking a look at like a snapshot in time.
That's right.
Not necessarily about moving forward with investments. Taking that snapshot to make an argument for moving forward with more investment. So
It's kind of the benefits today. But I think it's a fair point to say as you can grow transit, you get some accumulation of.
Right, obviously, the more robust the transit system is, the less likely it is that you're going to have to invest in new highway lanes and.
You got land use patterns that are more efficient.
Right,
and-
right.
Yeah.
So if there is, maybe there are other studies that can reference in regards to that, but I think it would be helpful, because I think, in my area, when we talk about tourism, they always throw out the, $7 back to the state for every dollar spent on tourism, or $11, whatever it is. It makes the $3 look not as impressive, but it is a much bigger
There's a much bigger picture.
picture, right?
I think for me, one of the things I hear all the time, which you guys probably do too, is transit doesn't pay for itself. It's not,
Right.
It's a bad investment because it doesn't pay for itself. And we all know in this room that no mode of transportation pays for itself. But I think even having this kind of return on investment information to be able to say, but there's benefits that are so far beyond just, fair revenue.
Sure.
It goes so much towards, the 2.9, return of $2.91 for each dollar spent demonstrates that the impacts are a lot broader. You can't just look at, how much.
Right, I think the fact that it's such a positive number is really helpful, right?
Yeah.
It takes that issue off the table.
Yeah, but to be able to kind of say, no, this is
No, actually
not
does.
a money loser. It's actually generating income for the state, generating benefits for citizens.
And that, to me, if you take that off the table as an issue, then you can focus on the last piece of slide 16, which is the additional things you're planning to add in, which is I was curious, just maybe a little bit more detail on how and what would that look like.
in the qualitative section.
Yeah, for the.
The group that's been working on this has been collecting information from other studies, and also other published information on how, for example, property values around metro stations have increased. They're not going to build it into the model, but to give some good information about what that effect has been. With some of the other ones, like economic development benefits, we'll likely talk a little bit about how Virginia's been able to leverage the presence of transit to attract new employers like Amazon to the Northern Virginia area and to other places. And so those are some general ideas. We do have some more specifics, but it's still being kind of developed at this point.
Transitioning to less polluting forms of vehicles also have an impact on the congestion side of things.
Mm-hmm. It would be the health benefits.
For me, that economic development is pretty important because what you have here is clearly jobs related to the transit or some small multiplying off of that.
Mm-hmm.
But Amazon HQ2 being one example, but we have plenty throughout,
Sure.
you know, around Metro or bus hubs, you get a lot more economic development.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And when you mention other reports, then it would be something like Brian from
Yes.
once we pull that.
Yeah, we consider creating our methodology, but also to incorporate in this qualitative and kind of just other results section. Look forward to it. Be interesting. All right.
Okay. Any other questions? Any other comments? Great work. Great. Yeah. That's for today.
So we're a little bit ahead of schedule, and I know we have, I think we have food outside too, but if you want, we can just kind of wrap up, which we'll all eat, and we can continue to talk. But, I mean, obviously there's, a big legislative session coming up, and I'm very cognizant of the legislative packages that have been getting discussed around the state right now. And, as, more will be forthcoming, I think, in the few weeks about, as the governor's budget comes out and we start to see various legislative proposals moving forward as well. I think that it is very important that we're all kind of talking on the same page about specifically the need for capital funding. We also know there's a need for more operating funding, but I think that, which isn't necessarily reflected in this data, I think that's a big piece of, all the budgets of the state, the local governments that fund transit, but I think the capital picture alone is a pretty big one. I think also thinking about the, bigger picture about things like regionalism, the need for, to provide more regional routes and working together better as a region, and that's, I'm not lumping any single region into that, except that it's just been a constant discussion in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, definitely here in Richmond as well, that I think we want to continue to emphasize too. And I know there's also been some discussion from VTA as well about low income or free fare programs. We were actually looking at some data the other day about fare revenues and how much is being collected by some of the agencies across the state. And there's a few places where it's shockingly low, actually. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that about discount programs and subsidized trips and things like that. But I know that is a discussion that's occurring more and more in the broader transit industry in the U.S., not just here in Virginia, but ways to look at trying to either establish fare-free zones or fare-free or lower discounted fares for certain groups of people. I think that's another discussion that I would expect will continue to unfold, particularly as VTA is, and I think there may be some legislation forthcoming. Budget amendment.
What's that?
Budget amendment. Budget amendment forthcoming about that. So I think those are also things that we all should be talking about, and talking about the importance of the economic impacts of transit and how it feeds into some of those issues too.
If I could just add to that, because we at NBTC, and I know I'm also here for VTA, the idea of providing transit benefits, we've talked about that a lot in the federal space. We have interest in how that can play itself out in the statewide space. But a part of that is not just those who have jobs, but those who are looking for jobs. And so that's some of the things that we have, VTA has in their legislative agenda. But the idea of providing incentives to pay for the fares, we've historically talked about fares for people who have jobs. So that's our commuter benefits. But the special one that I think is a really nice argument is for those who are looking for jobs. And so that's something that we're strongly supportive of, is the use of TANF funds to do that. And I think it's a really nice talking point, because it's about transit for job access for those who have and those who want a job. And so I do hope that others are also supportive of those types of initiatives in the General Assembly.
And there's that Harvard study that I know gets quoted all the time about how transportation is really the number one reason that, or barrier for people getting and seeking employment. It's transportation. It's not necessarily correlating to education or skills training. So I think all of those things will be important. I think also that obviously a lot of work has been done over the past several years on the prioritization process, the performance-based operating methodology. My personal hope is that we can kind of move forward from all of that and talk more about the pie and the amount of funding available, and the fact that we've got pretty good data that shows that in 2 years we are going to be seriously short on transit funding and how it compares to our needs. And I think another important part of that message still to some General Assembly members is to be able to say, but we have done a lot to get our house in order, if you would, in terms of, better strategic planning, making sure that we are working together more regionally, that we're allocating funds to the best projects that meet the state's needs. I think those are still important talking points and important things for us to emphasize, that a lot of work has gone into this over the past several years, but look at the fact that we're going to have a big revenue gap coming out very soon. So those are just some of the thoughts off the top of my head about how we can kind of take all of this and message it.
And let me just ask a question about that, because I think we have a role that we've been exercising for the past several years now. How many years?
2013.
2013. Okay.
And we've been hanging out together.
That's right. That's right. And whether it would make sense for TSDAC, in fact, to perhaps issue a short report on some of our activities over the course of that time period that have seen the work that's gone in the agency to improve efficiency, to ensure accountability, and to identify the real needs that would be something that could be issued with perhaps a press release and maybe some op-eds that could go out across the media in the state.
That would be great. I think we would definitely welcome that, and would be happy to help provide some help to you all as well with that kind of retrospective look about all that's been that's been done over the past 4 to 5 years to within the program, and how important that has been in terms of that accountability, and certainly we would welcome. I know I will be willing to go talk to anybody that we need to talk to be able to lay all of this out, but if we would also welcome some help with those two. So
that's intriguing, Chair, because I was thinking of that as the director was talking about everything we've done to date, and we want to shift to the size of the pie. If we're going to shift to the size of the pie, we got to get people comfortable and be transparent that all that work has happened, and we're in a good place.
And VTA has been putting out some good information lately too about the some of the what's happening within some of the systems, and I think all of this can be packaged together pretty well. Obviously, there's things that we can and can't do as a state agency that other people in the room can play a role in.
Right, and I think the fact that we're a legislatively authorized committee that's designed to help develop these formulas and provide this kind of not oversight, but in sort of deep investigation into what's happening, gives us an opportunity to do something like that. I don't know whether the members of the committee agree with that.
I would agree.
No.
And I would hope as well that, we're able to speak with a single voice on some of these, and that it doesn't devolve into regions against each other, or types of systems, because we all know all of our transit systems are unique. But we don't get into discussions about, why this type of transit system is more important than this type of transit system. I hope that we can continue to stay on the same page when we're out working with the General Assembly this year.
And if I could add that all of us represent those organizations that can bring a unifying voice to this. So I mean, I know I'm immediately going to go talk to our VTA folks about how, because we've done this before, come together, transit agencies across the state, and talk about what the universal message is. We're just going to have to do it in about a week. So, I know I'm committed to make sure that happens in terms of how we can work with VTA. And I hope the same thing with those who are representing other organizations.
Right. Okay.
Great. And the timing is challenging because it took you to get to here, and VML already adopted its legislative program in October. Locally, I just did it last Monday in VTA and VTC. But I think throughout them all, there's the core same theme.
We've always said sustainable transit funding. I mean, that's.
But the question is, how do we get it packaged quickly so we are speaking one voice?
Well, I think one of the things that would be helpful of a report like that this would be to be able to go to VACO and VML, for instance, and say, we want you to know what your representatives have been doing here and what the work of the committee has been.
And to the degree that, and you all represent those types of groups, so to the degree that, and often I know those groups do start getting together in early January here in Richmond to start gearing up for the legislative session. So if there are opportunities, board meetings or whatever that you all are aware of, I'm any one of us will be more than happy to go talk about it.
Yeah, because I think
VML and VACO are doing theirs together this year.
Yep.
Yeah.
February 6th will be the VML day.
And BTA Day is January 27th.
And the Northern Virginia legislative liaisons are starting to meet
Already had that.
the 13th. So your timing of your fact sheet on January 10th is like later than that, please.
No. Well, I wanted to point that out. I know and some of that just has to do with some internal work that still needs to be done. But as far as what we have here today, we can start packaging this and start, pulling all of this together, or you all feel free to do so as well, with the groups that you all represent. So,
Yeah. Putting it on the website can be, or emailing it to us is helpful.
Yeah, I think it is already on the website, but we'll make sure that you all, there's an interest in having that access to some of the information in a way that you can.
Thank you.
Yeah, very helpful. And we'll work on, we'll definitely be working on, I'm sure I'm always invited to go speak to the money committees and transportation committees, and so we'll be working on incorporating all of this into presentations that are appropriate for that audience, but hopefully to do some more one-on-ones with staff and things like that.
A lot of new folks. So is that good for our next gathering in the spring?
I would expect that following the General Assembly session would be a good time for us to get together.
Yeah.
See what
Great.
But no, we'll start scouting out some dates and start, looking at good time for us to all kind of reconvene once we see how the General Assembly session goes.
Do we have any public comments? Okay.
I would just like to say a few things if I could. I didn't know what to comment on. I didn't know what the contents would be of the meeting, but I'm very pleased that we will have a springboard to have data to support some of our comments and hopefully persuasive pieces for the General Assembly members. One of the things that I think we all realize is that with this data and starting with making the case for transit seems to coincide with a private market-driven demand for transit as well. So I think it's a moment for us to really press forward and make the case for transit. And I think that a lot of legislators are hearing that in their communities. And it is BTA's attempt to try to push more in that direction and bring in more stakeholders and to try to make the case even down to the local level or at the regional level. And as Director Mitchell mentioned, we've put together some data sheets for each transit system, and we have even grouped some of them regionally, and it's on our website. And we'll continue to reach out with some of this information with ridership, passenger miles, but also fuel savings and reduced emissions. We've been working very much with the environmental organizations to try to make that case. They've been pushing for electric vehicles, and while that's great, we know that's a long-term acquisition because of limited funds. So to help people understand using the transit that's available is also an environmental benefit. And so, so there are various stakeholder groups and interest groups around transit that we are trying to branch out and involve in our case that we want to make to legislators. The more they hear it from different constituencies, the more of an impact it will make. Thank you for giving us this springboard, and we intend to use it.
Thank you, Lisa.
And if I may, one of the things that, I get that question all the time, well, why do we need transit? We're all going to be running around in automated vehicles.
Yeah.
There's a lot of studies out there. I know TRV's done some work, and there's some other futurists out there that have been talking a lot about the future of transportation. And I would encourage you all to Google it and start, looking at those things. But universally, they've all said there's always still going to be, if anything, there's going to be a greater need for transit because we'll have now cars with less than one person per, occupancy in cars running around. And so there's going to be a need for high-capacity transit, buses, multimodalism, using technology to dispatch that. But we're not going to, all this futurism I've read about transportation is very clear that transit is still going to need to be part of the system going forward. So I would encourage you all as you're talking to legislators to be able to pull out some of that information too. So one other thought as well that just came to me too, this gets back to the overall transportation funding and sustainability issue. I would also encourage you all to not just look within the transit and environmental community for your allies and but to work with the road builders and to work with some of the labor groups and to work with some of the broader transportation stakeholders that are affected by overall transportation funding. And hopefully, there's not, going to be food fights between all of us, but I think it's important for, kind of the overall transportation community to be working together to say, we have a structural issue with the gas tax, and there's a problem with transportation funding, and we all need to work together to figure out how to address that.
Anybody else have anything like that?
I guess just one sort of process question. It sounds like we all nodded for a TSDAC report, so how do we pull that off?
Well, maybe one of the things we can do, and we'll talk about this, is if there's we can maybe put together at a high level some, bullets about what's been done over the, we can probably start rattling it off now, but it's, to talk about what the major issues are that have been tackled over the years, how TSDAC has worked together to address those, and all the good stuff and the good work that's been done over the, on accountability and transparency. We could probably put some of that together as a starting point for you all.
Sure.
Kind of go through the chronology of what's been, there's been 4 or 5 big topics that have all been tackled. So.
And if I get that information, I can work on a quick draft and circulate it to everybody. Revisions.
I like what you've done, but some of the outcomes, because we can show some of the successes from a couple rounds of funding.
I think we can actually pull a lot of it out of our general assembly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, we can pull this stuff together. We can pull some stuff together and get it to you.
Great. Okay. Well, unless I hear anybody else has got something, let me just thank everybody for coming today. Wish everybody a very happy holiday season. Hope that next week we'll have a nice little present Christmas tree. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting.
And lunch is outside, I believe. So for those of you that ordered lunch, we have